Hello everybody, welcome to the next part of this tutorial series. Last week we made our NPC base, and when we hit play we can walk up in front of that NPC base. We get our interaction box, we can press E for an interaction and we can walk away. And we did that using two blueprints with the interaction box here and the actual NPC here. Today, we're going to set up the structure for our dialogue tree, and I'm going to explain to you how that works as we're setting it up. So to start with, come down to our data folder, and you'll remember here that we created a data table for our images per controller. So here we have a table that is just a row name and an image, and we call this table to get the right image in our UI. This time we're going to do another data table, but it's not going to be an image row data table. You can see here row structure says rich image row. So the row structure is, if you remember how a structure works, think of it as the top line of an Excel spreadsheet. This time we're going to create essentially an Excel spreadsheet, but in Unreal Engine. And you can actually use Excel or other Excel-like programs to talk to Unreal and write your dialogue. Let's start by creating our structure. Come down to structures over here. Let's right click, blueprints, structure. This is going to be called S_dialogue. Let's open that up, drag that to the top. We're going to need 5 elements here, and I'm going to explain to you how those elements work once we get into the actual data table. Let's start with text. This first text is going to be name, so the name of our NPC. Next up, we're going to call this one index. All our NPCs in this game will have an index that we will refer to, because that's much easier for us to refer to in code than it is a direct name. You could misspell a name, but numbers are much harder to misspell. So that's going to be an integer. Another way to imagine that is every NPC, if you think of the last open world game you played with NPCs, imagine every NPC you could talk to had a number, and then you could just assign dialogue to that NPC via that number. Next up, let's add another one. This will be an integer. We'll call this one conversation. A conversation I would consider a group of lines. So when someone's giving you a mission, that would be the conversation, and the lines of dialogue would be the various lines inside that conversation. So the next one will be line. So that gives us 3 integers back to back, index, conversation, and line. And then one more, and we'll call this one dialogue. So this is where we'll actually write out the dialogue inside that we want our character to say. Another one we would do here as well, if we had, say, certain audio files that were attached to it, is audio. But because we obviously don't have voice actors at this point, we're not going to do that. This is just going to be a text-based dialogue system. And later on, if I find some dialogue lines, we can program that in as well. But let's start simple for now. So with all of that filled in, let's save that structure back over to the test map. Let's come up to data. Let's right click in data, and let's go over to miscellaneous, and we're going to a data table. The data table is going to look for a row structure, and we've just created that. So we want S_dialogue. And then we'll hit OK, and we'll call this D_dialogue. Open that up. And now here we can add a row. Remembering our Excel sheet analogy, we can add a row using these structures. So let's go ahead and add a row. This is our first row, and we're going to set up some example dialogue here that we can use with script later on. So let's give our first NPC a name. I'm just going to make one off the top of my head. So let's call him Fred. So Fred can be NPC 1. Here, he'll be the first NPC we talk to, and that number will go up as we add NPCs. He's definitely going to start at conversation 1, and he's going to start at line 1. So all pretty simple, straightforward. So the first conversation that Fred could potentially have with us in an RPG is if the prerequisites are not met. Let's pretend Fred is a mission giver, right? So the first thing that's going to happen, if we haven't done, say, a previous mission, which seems really unreasonable given that he's the first NPC we're going to talk to, but let's just pretend so that we can get a structure in our head. So conversation 1 will always be prerequisites. prerequisites not met. And if we press enter on that, our dialog will fill out here. Now let's add a new data row. And this time it's also going to be Fred. He's still index 1. It's going to be conversation 2, but still line 1 of that conversation. This might take a little while for you to get your head around, but I'm just going to keep going over it until you've got it. So the next thing that Fred could do, if we've met the prerequisites, which we will set up a system for checking later, but let's focus just on the dialogue now, is Fred could give us missions. So every time we come to conversation 1, it's always going to be prerequisites not met. And every time we come to conversation 2, it's always going to be to give missions. Let's add another row. Still Fred. Still index 1. So the name and the index should always be the same, unless someone's going to have a name change in the middle of their character development. This would be conversation 3, but still line 1. So the only thing we're changing at the moment is which conversation we're having. Another conversation we could potentially have with Fred is if, let's say, Fred asked us to pick up an item in the world, and we wanted to do this a little more realistically, where we could pick up that item before we've met Fred, rather than Fred spawning in the item by asking us to complete the mission. In this case, this would be a completed prior line, meaning that he gives us a piece of dialogue to say, oh, you've already picked up that item, or you've already killed that enemy. That way we're not always spawning things just because someone has sent us on a mission to do that thing. That's at least how I would prefer to run a game, because it's a little weird when you're playing a game, you go into, say, a dungeon, you walk past a podium, leave the dungeon, get a mission to go to that dungeon, and then suddenly the podium has an item on it that's spawned in just because the mission giver's given you the mission. So let's add yet another row. Still Fred. Still index 1. This will be conversation 4. And still line 1. This conversation will be reserved for if we haven't turned in the mission, but we've spoken to Fred again. So standing by, waiting for us to complete the mission. Maybe even taunting us if they're a bit of a smartass. Yet another row. Fred, index 1. Conversation 5 now. And line 1. And this would be turning in the mission. This will be where he gives us a reward, hopefully, if he's a good NPC. And then finally, one more row. Still Fred, still index 1, but this is conversation 6. And you might have guessed what it might be. It is no more missions to give. And I'm specifying no more to give because no missions to give could imply that he didn't have any missions in the first place. So these are the 6 conversations we could potentially have with every NPC. This is obviously set up more for a large scale side mission type thing, because when you're having dialogue with actual characters in your story, they're going to have a lot more to do. But this is the basic system I've created for this. So let's save that. Now, just a quick example for lines, because I know that the questions are going to come up and I want to explain how lines work. Let's say that Fred had 3 lines of dialogue to tell us he didn't have missions at the end, which seems unrealistic, but I just want to put these in here just as an example. So let's add another row. Let's pretend that everything is still the same as before. Fred, he's always going to be index 1 so that we always know which index he is to find him. It's going to be conversation 6, but this time line 2. So let's pretend Fred said thank you to us. That's how that would work. So when we had that conversation with Fred after turning in the item, and we spoke to him again after completing his mission, then he would say, no more missions to give, thank you. And because it's a second line of dialogue, then that would come up separately. If you imagine subtitles, you would have this title on the screen at one point, and then by pressing enter or whatever it is you want to use to progress your dialogue, then it would progress to this line. So that's how lines are going to work. And you'll see a better example of that when we get into the coding side of this, which is where we're going to go into the next episode. So I'm going to leave it there for now. And in the next episode, we're going to take this dialogue that we've created and put it into a character. So I'll see you then.